There is a strange kind of honesty that only appears when a person believes there is no tomorrow. Not when they are questioned. Not when they are cornered. Not when the police finally find the right door. But when they are lying in a hospital bed, listening to machines, feeling their body fail, and realizing that the story they buried 30 years ago may be the last thing they ever carry. That is when some people ask for forgiveness. And some people confess. In 2009, in Shawnee, Oklahoma, a man known by many people as Michael Anderson was sick enough to believe he was dying. He had suffered strokes. His speech was difficult. His body was weak. And according to reports from the time, he wanted to get something off his conscience before it was too late. So the police were called. Not because there had been a new crime. Not because someone had found a body. Not because a witness had finally come forward. But because a man in a hospital bed apparently wanted to talk about a killing from 1977. A killing in Tennessee. A killing that had followed him for more than 3 decades. And the first twist in this story is not that he spoke. The first twist is that Michael Anderson was not really Michael Anderson. His name was James Brewer. And in another life, in another town, under another name, he had been wanted in connection with the death of a man named Jimmy Carroll. For 32 years, the case had not disappeared. It had waited. And then, when James Brewer thought death was coming for him, the past finally found his hospital room. But death did not. That is what makes this case so disturbing. Because the confession was supposed to be final. It was supposed to be a man clearing his soul before meeting God. Instead, he survived. And suddenly the words he had carried to the edge of the grave became evidence in the world of the living. To understand why this story became so unforgettable, we have to go back to Hohenwald, Tennessee, in 1977. Hohenwald was not the kind of place where a killing vanished into anonymity. It was small enough for names to matter. Small enough for rumors to travel. Small enough for a sudden act of violence to leave a scar that people could still feel decades later. Jimmy Carroll was 20 years old. On April 27, 1977, authorities said he was shot outside a service station. Contemporary reports later described the motive as jealousy. James Brewer, they said, believed Carroll was involved with, or trying to seduce, his wife Dorothy. The details, as they came through later reporting, were simple in the way terrible things sometimes are simple. A confrontation. A gun. 2 shots. A young man left dying. Brewer was arrested not long after the shooting. He was charged. He was released on bail. And before the case could move toward trial, he and Dorothy disappeared. Not disappeared in a dramatic way. Not into the mountains. Not across an ocean. Not into some secret criminal network. They disappeared into ordinary life. For a while they reportedly lived in Nashville. Then Texas. Eventually they settled in Shawnee, Oklahoma, under different names. James became Michael Anderson. Dorothy used another name as well. They built a new life far away from Tennessee. And this is the part of the story that makes people uncomfortable. Because if you imagine a fugitive, you probably imagine someone always running. A man with cash in a bag. A motel room. A fake beard. A car idling outside. But according to people who knew the Andersons in Oklahoma, that was not the life they appeared to live. They were church-going. They were settled. They were known. They had family. They had routine. Reports said James worked as a machinist. Dorothy became involved in church life. They had a daughter. They became grandparents. To the people around them, they were not a headline from 1977. They were neighbors. And that is the unsettling question at the center of this story. How long can a person live as someone else before the lie starts to look like a life? 32 years is long enough for hair to gray. Long enough for children to grow up. Long enough for witnesses to age. Long enough for records to be misplaced. Long enough for a town to change. But not long enough for the dead to become irrelevant. Jimmy Carroll still had family. And his family did not get 32 peaceful years. They got 32 years without a courtroom ending. 32 years of knowing someone had been charged. 32 years of knowing he had left. 32 years of wondering whether the world had quietly decided to move on. Then, in 2009, James Brewer suffered another serious medical crisis. Reports describe him as weak after strokes, struggling to speak, and convinced he might not have much time left. And that is when the story becomes almost impossible to believe. Because according to several reports, Brewer wanted to unburden himself. Some accounts described it directly as a deathbed confession. They reported that he admitted shooting Jimmy Carroll and said he wanted to cleanse his soul before going to meet his maker. One detective was quoted saying that Brewer thought he was going to the great beyond. But there is an important complication. An Associated Press report at the time described the hospital conversation more cautiously. It said a detective thought he was about to take a deathbed confession, but Brewer, struggling to speak and caught between his own urge to talk and his wife's warnings not to discuss the case, stopped short of explicitly saying he committed the crime during that interview. That difference matters, because real cases are not campfire stories. They are messy. Reports can disagree. Words can be partial. A man recovering from strokes may be hard to understand. A wife may act as a helper, a protector, or a barrier, depending on who is describing the room. But the core fact remains chilling. A man who had lived for decades under another name, far from the killing he had been charged with, suddenly allowed his buried past to surface when he thought he was dying. And then he did not die. Imagine that hospital room. A man in bed. A wife nearby. Detectives listening. A voice damaged by illness. A past that had survived longer than some of the people who remembered it. And somewhere behind every word, a dead 20-year-old man named Jimmy Carroll. If Brewer expected death to close the door behind him, he miscalculated. Because he recovered enough to leave the hospital. And once he recovered, the question was no longer spiritual. It was legal. The man who had lived as Michael Anderson now had to become James Brewer again. He and Dorothy sold their possessions in Oklahoma. They left the home where they had lived for years. Then they went back to Tennessee, where the old charge was waiting. Think about that drive. Not as a newspaper detail. As a human moment. A man who had spent half his life under another name, crossing miles of road back toward the place where the old name still meant something. Every mile bringing him closer to the town he had left. Every mile removing the fiction of Michael Anderson. Every mile returning James Brewer to Hohenwald. For him, maybe it felt like surrender. For Jimmy Carroll's family, it may have felt like the world had finally remembered. But remembering is not the same as healing. Carroll's relatives were angry. They did not see an old, frail man and think the story had become softer. They saw decades of evasion. They saw a young man who never got older. They saw two sons who had lost their father. They saw a family forced to carry grief while the person charged in the case built another life. One of Carroll's sisters told reporters she wanted the case resolved before Brewer's health made it impossible. That is another cruel part of delayed justice. Time does not only hide the accused, it also erodes the case. Memories weaken. Witnesses die. Documents disappear. Evidence gets lost. People move. A clean legal story becomes covered in dust. According to reporting from that time, investigators said some witnesses were still alive, and authorities still had the gun used in the shooting. But other parts of the original investigation had been lost. Even questions about Dorothy Brewer's possible role remained tangled in the passage of time. Carol's family wanted answers about Dorothy too. They believed she had been involved, or at least had helped her husband escape. Authorities said she had been charged back in 1977, but a grand jury did not indict her. Decades later, records and memories did not line up neatly anymore. That is what 32 years can do. It can make even the truth harder to prove. And that brings us to the most haunting part of the case. Not the shooting itself. Not the false name. Not even the hospital confession that came too early. The most haunting part is the gap between guilt and consequence. If a person commits a crime and is arrested the next day, the story is horrifying, but direct. Action. Investigation. Trial. Punishment. But what happens when a person leaves, changes names, becomes respectable, goes to church, raises a family, becomes a grandparent, and spends 3 decades being known by people who have no idea what name he used to have? Does the past wait untouched? Or does it change shape? The pastor who knew the couple in Oklahoma reportedly said he did not know their former life, but he knew them as dedicated to the Lord. He said they had been in their own prison for 30 years, and he thought they had done their time. That sentence is disturbing because it forces a question most people do not want to ask. Can a private prison of guilt replace public justice? For the family of the victim, the answer is usually no. Guilt does not stand before a judge. Guilt does not return a father. Guilt does not explain to children why someone vanished from their lives. Guilt does not make a grave less final. But for the person carrying the secret, guilt can become a room they never leave. Maybe Brewer really suffered with it. Maybe he thought about it every year. Maybe every church service, every prayer, every family dinner had a shadow under it. Maybe he tried to become a different man and found that a different name was not enough. Or maybe he lived quietly until death frightened him. That is the thing about last-minute confession. It can look like remorse. It can look like fear. Sometimes it is both. When a person believes they are about to die, confession may be an act of conscience. But it may also be an attempt to escape the next world cleaner than they lived in this one. The problem for Brewer was simple. He made the confession too soon. Or, if we follow the more cautious version, he came close enough to confession, close enough to surrender, close enough to expose the truth of his identity, that the old case came alive again. Either way, death did not take him when he expected. So the living had questions. Police had questions. The court had questions. The victim's family had questions. And Brewer had to answer them not in a hospital room, but in Tennessee. There is a detail in this case that feels almost literary. Brewer reportedly returned with the same lawyer who had represented him decades earlier, before he disappeared. The same past. The same town. The same case. A much older man. A much older wound. As if the years in between were not erased, but folded. The man left as a defendant. He returned as a sick grandfather. But Jimmy Carroll remained 20. That is the imbalance in old murder cases. The accused can age. The families can age. Investigators can retire. Towns can change. But the victim stays fixed at the moment everything ended. Jimmy Carroll did not get a new name. He did not move to Oklahoma. He did not become a grandfather. He did not get to be remembered by strangers as a quiet church member. He remained the young man outside a service station in 1977. And that is why this story is not just strange. It is morally uncomfortable. Because every version of it leaves someone unsatisfied. If you focus on Brewer's illness, you see a frail man facing the end. If you focus on his years in Oklahoma, you see someone who may have tried to build a decent life. If you focus on Carol, you see a man who never got that chance. If you focus on the family, you see 3 decades of waiting. If you focus on the law, you see how time can make justice harder even when the past finally comes back. And if you focus on the hospital bed, you see the most unsettling image of all. A man trying to speak because he thinks there is no tomorrow. Only tomorrow comes. The reports from 2009 do not give this story a clean, cinematic ending. That may disappoint people who want every true crime story to end with a final answer, a final sentence, a final moral stamped on the file. But real life is often less satisfying. What we know is that James Brewer, who had been wanted in connection with Jimmy Carroll's killing since 1977, resurfaced after serious illness in Oklahoma. Reports say he had lived under the name Michael Anderson. He returned to Tennessee to face the old murder charge. Contemporary accounts differ on the exact nature of what he said in the hospital, but they agree on the larger picture. After more than 3 decades, the secret could no longer stay buried. And maybe that is enough to understand why this case feels so dark. Because it asks a question with no comfortable answer. If you carry a terrible truth long enough, does confession make you brave? Or does it only prove you were afraid to face it while you still had something to lose? James Brewer thought he was standing at the edge of death. He thought the last door was opening. He thought the words would leave his mouth, his soul would be lighter, and the living world would soon be finished with him. But the door did not open. He stayed. And once he stayed, the confession was no longer between him and God. It belonged to Jimmy Carroll's family. It belonged to Hohenwald. It belonged to the police. It belonged to the courtroom. It belonged to the name he had tried to leave behind. That is the part that makes this story impossible to forget. A man can change his name. He can change his state. He can change his church. He can change his job. He can change the people who know him. But if there is a body in the past does not become empty. It waits. And sometimes, when a man thinks he is about to die, the past walks into the room before death does. In James Brewer's case, death was late. Justice was later. And Jimmy Carroll had been waiting the longest of all.